Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Friday the 30th of August in London. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Kamala Harris pledges to turn the page but offers few specifics in her first in-depth interview since entering the US presidential race. China considers allowing homeowners to refinance $5.4 trillion of mortgage debt and making the case for more government spending. The UK's fiscal watchdog sees benefits from a ramp-up in public investment. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. US Vice President Kamala Harris has doubled down on her pledge to target price gouging in her first sit-down interview since entering the race for the White House. The Democratic presidential nominee says her day one priority would be helping address economic woes and supporting the middle class. Speaking to CNN, Harris sought to frame her pitch as an evolution of Bidenomics.
When we came in, our highest priority was to do what we could to rescue America. And today, we know that we have inflation at under 3%. A lot of our policies have led to the reality that America recovered faster than any wealthy nation around the world. But you are right. Prices, in particular for groceries, are still too high. The American people know it, I know it. Which is why my agenda includes what we need to do to bring down the price of groceries. For example, dealing with an issue like price gouging.
For supporters, Harris's CNN interview avoided a major gaffe likely to damage her momentum, while detractors are likely to argue that her answers were light on policy detail. The interview comes as a new Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll found the Vice President now leading or tied with Republican rival Donald Trump in each of the 7 states most likely to decide the outcome of the election. China is considering allowing homeowners to refinance as much as $5.4 trillion in mortgages. The plan is designed to lower borrowing costs for millions of families and boost consumer spending. Sources say homeowners would be able to renegotiate their terms before January, when banks typically reprice mortgages. Chinese authorities are facing renewed pressure to stem a housing-led slowdown in the country. The next wave of UK bank capital reforms may come later than expected. It's the latest example of a global financial hub abandoning its timetable for the changes. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
When regulators hashed out the final iteration of the Basel III post-crisis reforms in 2017, they intended to implement them by January 2022. But more than 2 years later, that goal is a distant memory. The delays are already a point of contention in the US, where banks are threatening to sue regulators over initial proposals. Now, sources say the Bank of England won't announce its finalised package until January 2026 at the earliest. Originally, the lender hoped to share its remaining plans by June this year. The central bank's Prudential Regulation Authority says it will publish near-final rules next month. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
The UK's fiscal watchdog says a boost to public investment would increase the country's growth by 2.5 times the amount spent over the long term. The Office for Budget Responsibilities Analysis warns of the risks of austerity just 2 months ahead of what the Prime Minister has described as a painful budget. Speaking to Bloomberg last month, Chancellor Rachel Reeves said she will both have to balance the books while achieving growth.
We're going to have to make difficult decisions. We need to fix the foundations before we can start rebuilding things in Britain. I asked the Treasury officials to give me an assessment of how much stronger the UK economy would be today if we'd have grown at just the average rate of OECD economies these last 14 years. And the answer is we'd be £140 billion bigger today.
Reeves has since cut back some government payments to pensioners and warned of tax rises to come in the October budget. The Chancellor will be seeking to reassure markets she is a trustworthy manager of the public finances, as the UK's debt is at a 6-decade high, and memories of the bond rout under Liz Truss's government remain fresh in investors' minds. Ukraine says it lost a US-made F-16 fighter jet in a crash that killed the pilot. Authorities believe the aircraft was trying to repel a Russian aerial attack at the time. The incident took place as the country endured its biggest drone and missile assault since the start of the war. MP Kira Rudik, who lives in Kyiv, says the impact is being felt.
For the last 4 nights, we are spending them in the bomb shelters. The attacks are significant, and Russians keep targeting our energy infrastructure. The majority of the day, we do not have electricity at homes.
Ukrainian MP Kira Rudik speaking there. The EU, meanwhile, has agreed to proceed with plans to secure Ukrainian aid from frozen Russian central bank assets. The bloc's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, says plans will go ahead irrespective of the US, which is seeking further assurances before pursuing congressional approval. Intel is considering potentially splitting up its business as it navigates the most difficult period in its 56-year history. Bloomberg has learned that chip maker has brought in Goldman and Morgan Stanley to advise on possible cutbacks and M&A moves. The company suffered a net loss of $1.6 billion last quarter, and analysts are predicting more red ink for next year. Bloomberg's Annabelle Drewler says the bleak earnings are making Intel consider some extreme options.
It's really that question now is how is Intel going to chart its path forward and where do they go from here, and looking at the different possibilities, and one of those, perhaps the most extreme, seems to be either splitting off or listing its foundry business, and that's really significant because Pat Gelsinger, who took the CEO role back in 2021, has really promised to turn around the company, and part of that is promising to build out the foundry division.
Annabelle Drewler speaking there. Shares in Intel have declined 60% this year compared to the 20% gain for the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Index, which is a benchmark for the sector. Now, in a moment, we'll bring you some analysis of Kamala Harris's interview at CNN, plus some more details on that story around Chinese mortgages. But another story that I've been reading from our Bloomberg Pursuits correspondent, Sarah Rappaport, on the popularity of branded merchandise from the world's top hotels. So Sarah was inspired to write this story because, and you may have noticed it as well, the number of people wandering around with tote bags, usually from some very fancy hotels. So she spotted ones from the Four Seasons in Athens or Newt in Somerset. And in her words, wearing swag from a beloved property has suddenly become the latest fashion flex, or the hottest fashion flex, I should say. It's a big business too. A bag from the Beverly Hills Hotel costs $218, or if you're looking for a different kind of merch, silk pyjamas from the Peninsula in London cost £620. Now, Sarah points out this is a trend that began during the pandemic. It's something to help to boost hospitality businesses that weren't able to bring in guests, but it's been a huge success for hotels since. Some high-end designers are getting involved in it as well, and she speaks to branding experts who point out that it's hard to get a unique souvenir while travelling, so a lot of people are making this decision instead to bring back something special from their trip. So more on that to be found on Bloomberg.com and on the terminal. Let's bring you more details now on Kamala Harris's interview alongside her running mate Tim Walls with CNN. Bloomberg TV anchor Kirti Gupta is with us for more. Morning, Kirti. What's your overall impression then? How did Kamala Harris do?
She performed well. She came off very presidential, very confident, but at the end of the day, wasn't very revealing in terms of getting more next steps. And I think that's why there was so much kind of hype in the build up to this interview, which is this idea that we don't actually know that much about what a Kamala Walls in the Oval Office may actually look like, from the economics policy to an immigration policy, how it actually differs from Bidenomics. This first interview with the press was meant to change a little bit of that, and instead it kind of did the exact opposite.
Okay. Did we get any more details on her economic policies?
We got a few details, but still not enough. Still falling short of some of the information that we needed. I think the key question going in here was, is Harrisnomics, which is, I think, the term we're going to be using now, different from Bidenomics, and how does it differ? And it feels like the line that we've gotten, the key line that we got overnight, is that it takes Bidenomics one step further. We've already had lines around price gouging, what she's going to be doing to continue protections around higher drug prices as well, protecting things like insulin for the people who really need it and making it affordable. She's also talking about extending it to groceries. She talked a little bit about not banning fracking. That was one of the criticisms around the Biden administration as well, that despite oil being one of the largest exports of the United States, fracking is a way to kind of undermine that economic growth and that level of industry. She was very clear yesterday. She said, no, there won't be a ban on fracking, but they are going to be regulating it in some way. Again, hazy on the details of what that actually looks like.
She was asked about Donald Trump's comments about her identity when he said that she had only embraced her black heritage for political purposes. Now, she sort of sidestepped the issue in her response. Is that significant?
It is significant in the regard that it has both boosted her and hurt her in a lot of ways. Look, one of the issues with, and I hate to say this in the 21st century, one of the issues here is that we've never had a female president in the United States. It's never happened, and certainly not one even of color. Very few of color have even ran. I think Kamala Harris is the first woman of color to have run. This is a really big deal, but it's something that can galvanize the demographic, gain the minority vote, gain the female vote. You've seen her kind of take a lot of coaching and a lot of following the footsteps of Barack Obama in terms of galvanizing the African-American population. However, it is also something that can work against her, especially when she's trying to appeal to parts of the country that maybe aren't as diverse. And that's, I think, why she really skirted that line carefully when asked about it.
Let's talk a bit about the response to this and the broader context in the race. What have we heard from Donald Trump? And perhaps it would be interesting too just to reflect on where we are in the polling too, given we've had new numbers out from Bloomberg News and Morning Consult.
Yeah, so the latest polling shows a slight edge from Kamala Harris over President Trump, but emphasis on slight. And this is a really big deal when we talk about just kind of the momentum that may be fading. And remember, one of the main themes that political strategists across the United States and arguably across the world have looked at is saying that right now the momentum around Kamala Harris has been a little bit of a whirlwind, a little bit of a vacuum. This idea that we had this very quick change in nominee. We had a very, what felt like an exciting race around who her VP pick would be. And then a very, again, galvanizing, to use that term again, DNC convention or Democratic National Convention. So she's had a couple of kind of key events, not to mention key rallies in certain states, including Milwaukee, which was the big one during that week of the DNC, where she has actually had moments to gain more momentum in her campaign, but then also make waves on social media as well, which she has absolutely tapped into to get that younger demographic vote. However, the concern here is that we are still in early days. We are still in summer months. Anything can change. This time last election cycle, you had Trump polling higher than President Biden as well, and then the election result was very different. So the expectation here is that this is still a little bit of a honeymoon period, and all polling should be taken with a grain of salt. But right now, the momentum isn't fading as fast as people thought it would, reflected in the polls.
Okay, Kriti Gupta, Bloomberg TV anchor, thanks so much for joining us with your analysis this morning. Now, China is considering allowing homeowners to refinance as much as $5.4 trillion in mortgages. That's part of efforts to lower borrowing costs for millions of families and boost consumer spending amid a weak economic outlook. Bloomberg News editor Jill Deesis joins us now for more on this story from Hong Kong. Jill, great to have you on. What exactly does this plan entail?
Hey, morning, Stephen. Well, as you said, we're looking at refinancing worth as much as $5.4 trillion in mortgages. The idea would be that homeowners could renegotiate terms with their current lenders before January. That's when banks typically reprice their mortgages. And this, they'd be allowed to refinance with a different bank. That would be a first since the global financial crisis. The other part of this, Stephen, that I think is really important to highlight here is that while a lot of the previous efforts that China has put into play in the past have kind of worked around, new first-time home buyers. This new plan would target existing homeowners. They've really been left out as a lot of those new home buyers, the ones that have really enjoyed a lot of the cuts to key interest rates that we've seen over the course of this year and such. So really just targeting a different group of people there.
How much could it help those households and those existing homeowners and the property sector more broadly?
Well, as you know, Stephen, obviously the Chinese government has tried to take several measures over the last several years to stem this massive housing rout. What we'd maybe see out of this, if it's approved, is that it may serve to ease mortgage burdens faster than we might expect. So while China has pushed average mortgage costs to a record low this year, most households really haven't benefited since those banks won't reprice their existing loans until next year. So maybe this sort of, opens the umbrella, expands the umbrella in terms of, homeowners that would be affected by some of the recent property easing measures that the Chinese government has taken to try to ease a lot of this crisis. You would have to see how long though it would take to kind of have all of that transmit through.
Could this put a strain on Chinese banks, Jill?
Yes. So the thing about this is that, you'd look at, lowering mortgage rates ultimately would hurt profitability at some, state-run banks. So it had further pressure on those banks, which, point out that Beijing has relied on quite heavily to help revive, its economic woes. That being said, though, you can make the argument that, authorities are still facing a lot of pressure to stem this slowdown, given how long it's really just persisted.
Talk us through just the backdrop to all of this as well. We've had a number of warnings this week about how the weakness of the Chinese economy is still causing concern.
Yes, I think at this point, Stephen, so if you recall back in March, the Chinese government set this economic growth target for the year, about 5% growth over last year. That's looking more and more in danger as a number of investment banks have really downgraded their expectations. UBS was the latest this week, sort of adding to those cuts. They think that China's GDP is going to expand around 4.6% this year. That's significantly below that economic growth target that the government set. That's also significantly lower than UBS's own forecast of 4.9% set earlier this year. It's kind of adding to some other banks, including JP Morgan and Nomura, which also think China is going to undershoot that target. Now, Stephen, the big concern here is that because of a host of issues, including most pressingly this real estate downturn that at this point has entered its fourth year, you're still seeing a lot of concerns over growth within the Chinese economy, particularly on that domestic side. So this idea that consumers just aren't, there's really weak demand here. Consumers just aren't really spending money. That just continues to be this persistent issue that doesn't really seem like authorities have really been able to shake here.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.